Okay, well, hello and welcome to all of our customers, colleagues and guests joining us today for a special webinar event. My name's Claudia. I'm a Senior Sales Executive here in Melbourne, Australia. And on behalf of our local Randox team across Australia, New Zealand, Pacific Islands and Japan, we thank you all for your interest and participation. So today we'll discuss Randox's External Quality Assessment Scheme, which is now the largest EQA scheme in the world, RIQAS. And to explain our report interpretation and discuss how to troubleshoot any test issues through your EQA results, we're very grateful to be joined today by our international RIQAS technical expert based at Randox HQ in Northern Ireland, Stephen Doherty. But just before we hear from Stephen, we'll go through a short introduction to the company. We'll explain some key features of RIQAS as an EQA scheme for your laboratory. We'll look at some popular programs across the APAC region and some real peer group statistics from these programs on common instruments. And then from there, Stephen will take us through report interpretation and troubleshooting. And then we'll finish with a live Q&A for your chance to ask Stephen any RIQAS related questions. So if you do have any questions that you think of throughout the session, maybe if we can pop them all into the chat box here, and then Stephen will answer them at the end of the session. So Randox is the UK's largest diagnostics company, established in 1982. And today, across our main Northern Ireland manufacturing sites and other sites around the world, we manufacture 4.1 billion diagnostic tests annually. And it's estimated that over 370 million people, or 5% of the world's population, are diagnosed using a Randox test every year. Randox played a key role in the COVID-19 response over the last few years, testing over 26 million COVID samples in-house and helping to keep local communities safe. Now, Randox tests are supplied around the world to over 100,000 laboratories. In terms of our team members and staff, we have a diverse and experienced team of now over 2,500 employees across 145 countries, and 800 of these employees are dedicated R&D scientists and engineers. The Randox Group comprises of many product and service categories. From where it began in 1982, manufacturing quality controls and chemistry reagents, we've now grown to accommodate many other needs of laboratories, including toxicology, point of care, multiplex immunoassays, and what we're here to discuss today, our external quality assurance or proficiency testing scheme called RIQAS. RIQAS stands for Randox International Quality Assessment Scheme. And as I mentioned, it's the world's largest EQA scheme, boasting over 65,000 laboratory participants across 145 countries. And with a flexible portfolio of 36 highly consolidated programs, RIQAS can offer a variety of options to cover a wide test menu. Importantly, RIQAS is a UCAS accredited proficiency testing provider, and we're accredited to ISO 17043 conformity assessment for proficiency testing providers. Being the world's largest EQA scheme means that peer group numbers are maximised for a wide range of test instruments and methods. The highly extensive and consolidated range of programs hopes to reduce the number of individual programs required to cover your test menu, hoping to save laboratories both time and money. And there are reduced parameter options for selected programs, which offers greater flexibility for you. Additionally, you can register up to 5 instruments per program, volume permitting, at no extra cost, and that allows comparative assessment across multiple instruments of the same instrument in your laboratory. The simple user-friendly reports, as Stephen will soon show us, RIQAS reports are set out in 1 page per parameter format, which enables at-a-glance performance assessment. There are complementary multi-instrument and inter-laboratory reports for networks of laboratories to compare between their affiliated sites. And RIQAS also offer end-of-cycle reports, and these summarise performance compared to your previous RIQAS cycle if you were a participant in the previous year. Another great feature of RIQAS is the timely and relevant reporting frequency. Every RIQAS program now has a turnaround time of less than 72 hours for your reports. And that means with your EQA result in your hand less than 72 hours after submission, you can identify system errors and implement any necessary corrective actions sooner rather than later. And high quality, clinically relevant materials. RIQAS materials are high quality human samples free from interfering preservatives. And that is so it can increase our confidence that your EQA performance mirrors the performance of a patient sample. All immunoassay materials are actually 100% human material, offering the most commutable matrix for EQA samples. And not just that, but they're at clinically relevant levels. So the concentration ranges across each cycle aim to be wide and varied and clinically relevant to challenge your test system where it matters most. Now, here are a few examples of popular programs from around the Australia, New Zealand, Pacific Islands, Japan regions. Firstly, this is the General Clinical Chemistry program. This program contains all of your routine chemistry parameters, as well as some more niche analytes, which are exclusive to RIQAS. As you can see here, for example, your D3-hydroxybutyrate, NEFA, copper and zinc, total bile acids, GLDH. This year, the program had over 14,000 participants, which is a very extensive network of global peers to compare your results to. The samples are lyophilized, human-based serum. They make up to 5 mils per sample. And there are flexible options here, so you can choose a bi-weekly program, choosing 10 or 17 or all 56 parameters, or you can choose a monthly program with all 56 parameters. The General Immunoassay program is another popular program in our region and a great example to show you the extensive peer network today. So this contains all of your routine immunoassay tests, including endocrinology tests, cancer antigens, and some therapeutic drugs. This year in the immunoassay program, there were over 7,000 participants worldwide, again, offering a very extensive network of peers, which is one of the greatest advantages of RIQAS. These samples are lyophilized, and as I mentioned, immunoassay programs are 100% human serum. And there are flexible options for this program too, so either a bi-weekly or monthly reporting option, and you can choose for 13 or 51 parameters as you need. So now here are the real peer group data from these two programs to give you an idea of how the peers are distributed across many popular instruments that we see in this region. And we can see across both chemistry and immunoassay programs the spread of peers across various Abbott, Beckman, Roche, Cobus, Siemens instruments. And you can see that new instruments such as the Cobus Pro and Pures have relatively a large amount of peers already on this program. But then on the other side of things, some older instruments in this list, which you might be starting to lose some peers locally as these instruments begin to fade out, you can still see that there are plenty of peers here still on the global RIQAS programs. And this is the full list of RIQAS programs available. There are now 36 programs, and they range across a variety of laboratory disciplines: chemistry, immunoassay, hematology, coagulation, infectious serology, and most recently, our microbiology program. And if you are interested in any of these programs, these on screen are your local Randox contacts, including myself here across in Victoria, South Australia and Tasmania, Jamie, who's on the call today from WA, Sylvia from Queensland and Northern Territory, and Fulia from New South Wales and ACT. In New Zealand, joining us today, we also have Mohammed, and for Pacific Islands and Japan, you may know Summer. If you're joining us from another international market and you are interested in any of the RIQAS programs today or need more information, you're welcome to contact Anna. So now I want to introduce to you our RIQAS technical expert, Stephen Doherty. Stephen studied at University of Ulster and graduated with Bachelor of Science honours in Applied Biochemical Sciences. He has worked in the field of EQA since 1992, since he joined Randox in the RIQAS department. He's been involved in all aspects of the RIQAS department, but most of all managing technical queries, report validations and software development of RIQAS. In 2004, he took up the position of manager for RIQAS, and has travelled widely representing RIQAS at international trade shows and conferences and user group meetings. And most importantly, in the past 30 years, has helped RIQAS grow to be what it is today, the largest proficiency testing provider in the world. So welcome, Stephen.
Turn my mic on. Sorry. Yes, well, good morning from the UK, or good afternoon for everyone down in Australia, New Zealand, and all the territories on the southern side of the world, or who knows, are we on the south? It's a global village nowadays, and especially with obviously with us being an international scheme, we're very much dealing with all parts of the world. So it's a pleasure to be with you here today. And will I just take control here then, Claudia?
Yep, that's fine.
Yeah.
Can you?
Let me see. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Well, yes. Hello, everyone. And as I say, it's a pleasure to be with you today. And today, I'm going to be going through some of the more details of the RIQAS reports. But initially, really, I want to just start by, oh, let me see if no, it's not moving on. Can you see that? Has that moved? Yep. Okay. So why use RIQAS? Well, why indeed? There's lots of reasons, as Claudia's just taken us through some of the main features. Why use RIQAS? Because RIQAS works. Today we're going to be talking about that, how RIQAS works, but also we're going to talk about here just physically that RIQAS does work. What does it do? It enables us to, or it helps you to improve your performance. If you can see just in the globe there, sorry, Australia's moved off the map at this moment in time, but all the dots represent users that we have. And as you can see, we are spread out globally around the world. And why I say that RIQAS aids the performance improvement, well, this is because whenever I look at how labs have improved their performance over time, it's quite clear that RIQAS does work. Recently, I did a review of the labs and how they've improved performance, and as you can see, we had almost 1,800 incidences across our programs of improvements in performance. Now, I'm going to talk about RMTS shortly. RMTS is our running mean target score. and this is an average performance. So what we're talking about here are labs that have improved their performance from even from unacceptable levels to acceptable, or from where you need for improvement to having good performance, or even really to improve it to excellent performance. So I'm very confident that RIQAS does work, and it has worked for many labs around the world. One of the main reasons for that, as Claudia has already pointed out, is the frequent analysis and the rapid feedback. And I just want to show you two examples here of the performance. So hopefully you can see that on the screen. The blue represents the performance of our bi-weekly or participants in our bi-weekly scheme, and the orange color is the monthly. And what does this show? Basically, all apart from one instance here, which was for HBDH, the average performance of labs running our bi-weekly scheme was better than our monthly. So that's our chemistry, and the same goes for our immunoassay as well. And here you can see once again the performance of our bi-weekly participants perform better than our monthly. So I suppose the question is, well, why is that? It's the same material. Both schemes have participants from around the world. They're both global. They both have very similar or exactly the same similarities of sort of peers, except the monthly has a slightly larger peer group. It doesn't matter how long the labs have been participating. So what's the difference between the bi-weekly and the monthly? Well, it's basically that the bi-weeklies have more reports. They are able to take corrective actions earlier. They're able to check the effectiveness of those corrective actions. Of course, you can't do that unless you're able to then interpret the reports. So this is really what we're going to do today, to see how we can get the most out of the reports and how we then look at that in our EQA troubleshooting. A lot of these will carry across multiple EQA schemes, but of course, what we're presenting today is for RIQAS. If you do have any questions, just let me remind you if you want to add them into the chat, and we'll talk about them then at the end, and we'll have a live session for questions and answers. Okay, so understanding our quantitative reports. We have three types, mainly. We have our main quantitative reports, which covers our chemistry, immunoassay, proteins, drugs, etc. And we have our semi-quantitative, which is for our serology reports. And also we have some qualitative reports as well, as in for like our new microbiology program. So understanding quantitative reports. As Claudia said, we have a single page type report for each parameter. But each page itself is broken down into 7 sub-reports, each providing a variety of performance indicators. And as you can see, it's all very color coordinated, and it allows for easy interpretation. So let's very quickly then just jump in and look at each. So main stats. Now, I'm not going to discuss today how the actual stats are actually calculated. If you want that sort of information, we can provide it to you. There's more information as well in our RIQAS Explained brochure that you can find online as well. But our main stats is what you're going to be obviously compared against. There are 3 levels for the majority of our programs, and the main one that you'll be compared against will be your chosen peer group. So that is the base level for comparison. So it's your selected instrument slash reagent. That will be part of a method, and which then, of course, then makes up all the results globally. So that'll be the all methods. Now, at the moment, we are only providing a global comparison. We're not providing comparisons to a subset of results for national schemes, for example, national programs. So this is a global comparison you'll be compared against. And as Claudia was mentioning, you will tend to have more participants using a certain instrument, a certain method than globally, as opposed to just on a regional basis. So you do tend to have larger peer numbers. But what you'll see here then is, as I say, apart from those three levels of statistics, they're broken down in this fashion. So for each, you'll have the number of returns. Out of this, then you'll also have a number of results which have been excluded from the calculation of the mean from the target. So overall, for example, in this case, you'll have had the 213 plus the 15. So there were 228 labs who actually submitted results. 15 of those were excluded as outliers for the generation of the mean. You will have a calculated CV as part of that, so that corresponds to one standard deviation. But we don't actually use the calculated SD in our assessment performance. What we use is an SDPA, which stands for our standard deviation of performance assessment. What's the difference? It's basically that the SDPA is based on a fixed target, which we review annually. The advantage of that is that you don't have large variations from sample to sample. For example, if the instruments all performed very well, if it was like a normal sample and everyone performs very well and the CV was very tight, very small, then what can happen is a very small deviation can cause a large SDI or Z score in this case. So what we do in order to rule that out and to give us a more level performance over time, then we use this SDPA, which is based on a fixed annual performance. We'll talk about that more just as we move on through the presentation. If there are insufficient numbers in your instrument group, and at the moment 5 is our minimum number that we set, then you will move up and be compared to the method level. If there are insufficient in the methods, then it will jump up to the all methods in general. Happens very infrequently, but there would be some occasions for some of our very smaller parameters that may have occur. Okay, so your actual performance indicators. So they're all based on basically how far you are away from the target. And it's broken down as follows. So you'll have the SDI, that's your standard deviation index, so it's basically number of SDPAs away from the target. You'll have the percentage deviation, which is the same just in terms of actual deviation. And this is the one that we would suggest whenever you're doing a comparison to your internal QC, that you look at it in terms of percentage deviation. Because obviously our SDs are not going to be the same as the SD range that you have on your internal QC. So in order to do a comparison between the two, we would suggest that you look at it in terms of percentage deviation instead, so that you have a like-for-like comparison, compare apples to apples, etc. We then would have our target score. A target score is a unique scoring system that we have developed within RIQAS. It's an absolute score, so it's not affected by negative values. So you're simply looking at a score between 10 and a top score of 120. So 120 is the top, is the best that you want to. That's basically what you want to achieve. And as I say, we'll look at that in a bit more detail as we move on to the presentation. Um, They're all based on, let's just say, the target that's being calculated. The targets you'll see here, the mean from comparison, and you'll have your results. So once again, a bit of color coordination going on here. The blue for the method, or sorry, blue for the instrument, green for the method, and it's white for the all methods. And then the triangle. Once we look at the histogram moving forward, you'll see how that all gets represented. You'll see then as well 3 other values here, which are these running mean scores, and these are the average of your last 10 results. So for each set of results that you get back, you can compare how your current result compares to your average results or your historical results. Excuse me. Thing to mention then, pardon me, that the SDI and the percentage deviation, because then you'll have positive and negative values, then they can average out. And so it can give you a slightly false indication of your overall performance, whereas the running mean target score being an absolute score, always on the positive side. So it's just basically how high the score is. They are good for looking at trends over a period of time. And once again, just to mention that they do cover the full concentrations, whereas the SDIs, or so the individual scores, will just be looking at that a single concentration at that time. Histogram is the next chart down. And if we zoom into that, you'll see where the color coordination comes into play. So we have your result represented by the triangle, and you can see here basically how this fits into your instrument, how your instrument, your peer group compares to the methods, and then how the method compares to all methods altogether. So I must admit, I really do find the histograms very useful for whenever I'm starting to look at troubleshooting aspects, because it's quite simple to see then the distribution of your peers and how you compare to your chosen peer group. It also then really does highlight the point that you have to have your assay set up correctly in the first place. So it is vital that you're correctly registered in the correct instruments, correct methods, reagents, and as well with your chosen units. I didn't mention that in the first section, but all the stats are presented to you in your chosen unit. So it is vital that you get that correct as well. I was very recently just on another trip there to the to Romania and Moldova, and we were visiting a customer at that stage, and it was clear that they hadn't actually registered their assay details correctly, and they were using the wrong units, and it was seriously affecting their performance. About 80% of the issues that we see are based on assays and assays being incorrectly registered. So it is vital that that's done and is correct in the first instance. So histogram, as I said, shows very clearly whether there's any biases. But it's quite clear here, for example, that the instrument group has a positive bias compared to the all methods. So as you can see, it's not specifically an individual instance here for an individual lab. It's the whole peer group has the bias. Now, hopefully you'll see this on your screens if it's large enough, but then this is a prime example of where things can go wrong. So we have this example here where you have an individual lab, doesn't compare to their chosen peer group, but yet they compare quite well to the other methods. So what are the possible issues that may be occurring here? So they could be registered in the wrong method, as we just previously discussed. They may actually be um, in the wrong method group. It could be that the lab has started to use a new reagent or a new batch of reagents with different standardization. As we all know, a lot of the reagent manufacturers they're constantly bringing out new reagents, new standardizations. There can be multiple methods in the market at any one time. So it may be that they have moved over to a new reagent, but they haven't informed us of those changes. Once again, registered in the wrong method. Could be that the lab simply has developed a bias, um, although this may be a, something that they've introduced themselves because of that they weren't comparing to the actual overall instrument peer group. So they may have decided that they will recalibrate and change and introduce a factor to match up with the null methods. It could be that they are, as I say, using, and this does happen as well, that they are using a non-dedicated reagent for that instrument, and that's the reason why they don't compare to the instrument group, is because that they are using a different reagent, one which is not dedicated for the instrument system. And of course, it could just be a random outlier. So how do we know which one is correct? Well, it's difficult to tell, obviously, just looking at the histogram. And this is the first instance, really, where I want to say that all of the charts need to be used in conjunction with each other. They're all providing separate information, and they're all providing you with uh, very useful information, but they have to be combined. This histogram doesn't provide you with any historical information. So we don't know whether this is new, we don't know whether this has been going on for some time, etc. So we need to use all of the charts together. The next section down is basically our multi-method stats section, and really just providing you the stats for each of the individual methods. Now, so if you are comparing to another method group, you may then want to look at this section. Basically, you may, if you're not comparing to your peer group, you may want to look at this section basically to see if you compare to another method. Now, we can only fit so many on the chart, so I think it's up to a maximum of 15. Some parameters will have more methods than that. So if it doesn't show in this, you can certainly you can contact us and we can provide this separately for additional information. If we move up to the top on the right-hand side, then we start looking at the various charts which show performance over time. So Levy-Jennings, this is very similar to what you would all know from your internal QC. Very similar, looking for trends, looking for sudden shifts in performance. And yes, it does look very similar to your internal QC charts, but just to reiterate that they're not comparable because our standard deviations obviously will not be the same as your standard deviations and your ranges that you have within your internal QC. So the two, although they should follow the same sort of patterns, won't necessarily match up. And this is, of course, what we're looking for in EQA. So we're looking for those hidden biases that your internal QC isn't detecting. But the actual chart itself, it's quite simple, where current result on the right-hand side and then moving back in time. Depending on what program that you're participating in, whether it's a bi-weekly or monthly, then you'll see the sample number accordingly going along the bottom. So whether it's one sample per month, so it would be from 12, or whether you'll have then a bi-weekly scheme. So along the top of the chart, you'll also see the concentrations. Now, the concentrations give an indication of, so if you do see any particular biases for any particular sample, then you can see what the concentration was at that sample. We'll talk about that more then as we move on through the presentation today. So you will see also then a couple of other just notifications here for corrections and for non-returns. You can submit a correction for a result if it's the sample has been made up incorrectly in the wrong volumes, for example, for the lyophilized material, or if the wrong results have been submitted, or it's been a simple typo, then as long as those results are submitted to us within 4 weeks, i.e. before the next sample, then we can correct those for you. So really what we're looking for here, once again, very color coordinated. We want to be stay in the white and out of the red, and we're looking for acceptable performance of less than 2. So an SDI of less than 2 for our performance indicators. The next chart is then our target scoring chart, and this is the formula for the target scoring. And as you can see, it's quite simple, and it depends on, once again, deviation from the target, which is this value here, but you're comparing that to this TDPA. And what's TDPA? That's our target deviation for performance assessments. It's a fixed limit that we set annually. It's based on the performance that 90% of labs can achieve. So it is an analytical performance, and we're looking at, so what's the analytical performance, as I say, of 90% of the labs performing. So we're looking at that over a course of a year, maybe actually sometimes longer, to provide us with enough information. And really what we're doing here then is comparing your current deviation with this average performance of this acceptable performance. If it's the same, so if your deviation is the same as the limit, you'll finish up with a score of 50. If your deviation is better than the performance limits, then this value will be smaller. This overall value here then will be larger, so you'll have a higher score. Vice versa, if your deviation gets larger, you're moving away from target, then this overall value here will be smaller and you'll have a lower score. It is possible using the formula here to calculate a score of less than 10 and greater than 120, but they're the upper and lower limits that we set basically to make the system work for basically for our participants. But it is possible to achieve a score greater or less than the overall limits. We present that then in the chart. You'll see the TDPA then getting along the top of the chart, and this will change annually. Once again, it's a current result on the right-hand side and moving back in time. Quite clear, quite simple to understand. Once again, just to reiterate that this is an absolute score, so there's no positive, negative values associated with this. So percentage deviation by sample chart, this is what we were discussing earlier. This is the main one that I would suggest that we use for comparing to the internal QC to give you a like-for-like comparison. We'll have 20 plots again if you've been performing for that length of time. Current results on the right-hand side, moving back in time. The acceptable limits then are shown as the red bars along the top and bottom of the chart. And the thing really to mention with this then as well is that the scale is different. Unlike the Levy-Jennings chart, where it's a fixed standard deviations from 0 to 3, in this case, the scale will change from parameter to parameter. So just something to be aware of. So if you're doing a comparison between parameters, the actual then limits will differ from parameter to parameter. Okay. Now, the next thing really to mention then is the open circles, because we've started to show another plot here, which are the open circles, and these are the running mean target scores. So as I mentioned before, these are useful for looking for trends over a period of time, and they do then help with giving an indication of performance over that full concentration range. So for example, this plot here, which is our current running mean target score, or sorry, in this case, sorry, our running mean percentage deviation. This will be the average of your last 10 individual plots. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The actual performance indicators then, they are useful if you are fluctuating as you should. Normal distribution, you'll have fluctuation around the target. And in this case here, it does give you a good indication. And some labs will use this then for their uncertainty of measurement calculations for their bias aspect. But as I mentioned before, because they can average out, then it can give you a false indication of your bias. But it is useful if it's consistent and if it's fluctuating around your target as it should. Here's an example of that, where the performance is quite steady and quite a constant bias. And in this case, this is a good indication of the performance. But once again, all you need is necessary a few poor results, and this will drag this down significantly. And it won't then average out again until your 10 results have moved on. Percentage deviation by concentration chart. This is the only one which isn't in sample order. But it's useful basically to see the concentration or the performance at any individual concentration. Because it's not in sample order, we have to identify what the current result is. So in this case, we've changed it so the current results by the black square. You then will have up to the previous 20 results, then also across a concentration range. If you have changed methods, if you've changed unit, etc., somewhere through your historical through the last 20, then you may not see all of the plots. We'll only show you the plots for those samples which are in the same chosen or the same current peer group. So if you've changed methods, if your performance has changed significantly, well, not that your performance has changed significantly, but if your assays have changed, then we'll only show you a comparison against your current assay setup. This chart is useful, for example, so if you want to see any concentration-related biases. So in this case, current sample matches up at the high concentrations, whereas at the lower concentrations, the performance is much more variable. We'll look at this in a bit more detail just as we move on, but you have to use this in conjunction with then the other charts, which are in sample order. Because what this chart then, even though it's useful to show you the concentration-related biases, it doesn't show you whether you have made corrections to your performance. Because it's not in sample date order, then we don't know, for example, whether these plots here are actual something historical that you have actually corrected, and that these are your current ones. So you have to use the two charts together, and we'll have some examples of that as we move on. So, okay, how do I interpret my report and what do I do with the information? So you've got your reports back. What's the first thing you should do? Well, in general, what we would suggest is you jump to, in our case, the back page of the report, where we have a historic, well, we have an overall, a table which shows overall performance for all your parameters. And you'll see a number of different things for this. So you'll have all three performance indicators for each parameter. If they're in bold and underlined, these are the parameters that have failed for those for this individual sample for the performance indicators. And if all three have failed, then you'll have the triangle appearing on the right-hand side. So these tend to be the ones that you want to look at first of all, just because it's highlighting those. It doesn't mean that you don't look at the other parameters, but maybe these are the ones that we need our attention in the first foremost. So in this case here, we look at the performance for the carbon dioxide, calcium, glucose, and sodium. So we can see that the three performance indicators, out of those, glucose is the worst. Why we say that? It has the lowest target score, it has the lowest percentage deviation, etc. So it's quite simple to see then which samples or which parameters, sorry, are failing for this individual sample. But what we can do then is look at the running mean scores as well. For in this case, we can see that the actual performance is still good. Previous performance is still good. So this is something for this sample, which is unusual, abnormal. But as I say, we need to look at the other charts then to see whether this is something which is new or something which is then starting to develop. So are we starting to see a trend, or is this a sudden shift in performance? So in this other example, you can see where only two of the performance indicators are underlined or in bold. So in this case here, for oxygen, then you can see that the SDI hasn't reached the performance limits, still less than that than the two, so no red triangle. So the question is, do you look at that? Well, of course, I think it should. If you've got two performance indicators, that are starting to show this poor performance, then this is certainly something that you'd want to look at. But it hasn't reached for all three at this stage. Okay, so looking at long-term performance. So if we look in this case here, which of the three performance indicators are show the historical information? Well, that's your running means. Which one then is showing you the best long-term performance? Well, as I mentioned before, the running mean SDI and running mean percentage deviation, because they can average out with positive and negative values, then they, in general, don't give you a very accurate indication of long-term performance. So what we would suggest is looking at the running mean target score. So in this case here, we can quite simply see that, well, in this case, it's, chloride has a score of 113, but the pH is the top one with 120. So that certainly has the best long-term performance. So it's quite simple, once again, but just to see how your overall historical performance for each individual parameter is how each is performing, not only for the current sample, but long-term as well. Now, If we look at this percentage deviation chart, as it was just overall, the running mean is excellent, well within our performance limits. But as you can see, overall variability is quite wide, with some quite exceptional poor performance. So this is just highlighting the fact, as I say, that using the percentage deviation, using the running mean SDIs can sometimes give you a false indication of overall performance. Okay, sometimes you will see the likes of this. In this case here, where you have multiple parameters then failing, with all being flagged. So in this case here, it's quite clear then as well. Well, hopefully it'll be clear in a second, what's wrong with this sample. In this case here, well, first of all, yes, all been flagged, as I've just mentioned. So, and as we can say, the issue is likely to be either a wrong sample or it's been a reconstitution error. But how do we tell the difference between the two? Generally by looking at the percentage deviation. If it's been a reconstitution problem, then all the parameters will tend to have the same form of deviation because it's all been affected. Each parameter is being affected by the same ratio. So tends to be the same percentage deviation. Whereas if we look at this example, where you have the percentage deviation where they're all varied, then this would tend to indicate that the wrong sample has been run. Once again, non-analytical problems, so either reconstitution or typographical errors, or in this case, you've actually just measured the wrong sample. Those sort of situations, please just send us the correct results. And as long as it's done within the right time frame, then we can correct those for you. Now, so far we've only looked at the individual samples, but what if you're in charge of a large group of labs or you have a large number of instruments? Then we also provide with instrument and interlaboratory summary reports. Now, in this case here, slightly different layout, but what you'll see are the percentage deviations being presented here. And this is displayed for each individual instrument that you have registered in your group. Particularly useful if you, for example, blood gas or some coax, where you have large number of instruments or anything sort of with a large number of point of care systems. This can come in useful as well. So what we'll have here presented is the current sample, and then all, in this case, your 9 previous samples. Anything which is outside of limits will be flagged and highlighted, and you'll see then a color coordinated for each of the charts. Sorry, I've gone the wrong way. I'll just go back a slide. And here you can see if you've got a large number of instruments in your group, this can look very confusing. So of course, what you're looking for are the exceptions. You're looking for the ones which are top and bottom, who are maybe not performing as well, who are performing with a bit of a bias. But it still can get confusing if you have a large number of instruments. So what I would suggest in this case is that you look at the reports that we can provide in CSV format. And looking at this, you may think, oh my word, this is even worse, providing just all the stats with no charts. But once we add in our filtering, then it's very simple. We can filter by instrument. We can filter by registration, so looking at each individual participant within your group. Or perhaps we want to sort by parameter and result. Within that, then we can add conditional formatting. And with all this, then it actually starts to highlight, so you can very quickly assess a large number of participants, a large number of registrations, methods, instruments very quickly. And you can see which ones are performing poorly or not. We can then as well add in, or should I say, filter on the poor performance indicators. So the red triangle that you would normally see on the report is then presented as an asterisk within the CSV file. So very simply then, if you just want to go and look for them in the first instance, then quite simply just filter on the asterisk, and that will automatically then just show you those parameters, those instruments which are performing poorly, or that have failed, sorry, the performance indicators. So a very quick method for a review of a large number of instruments methods for if you're the coordinator of a large group, for example. Okay, we're going to move on and look at, so this is the quantitative report. So we're going to look at how do we actually identify problems on the charts, and we're going to go through a number of examples in this case. So here we have a Levy-Jennings chart, your SDIs, and then the concentration, percentage deviation by concentration chart. Okay, so if I was to present this to you for the Levy-Jennings, this is potentially something you may see. So you may see a sudden shift here, then a downward trend. You're running then with a negative bias for a particular period of time. Then, as you can see, the concentrations have started to shift back upwards again. Okay. If we look then at the concentration chart, we see a slightly different picture. So we're looking at here, higher concentrations are running very tight performance. And as the concentrations go down, the performance is then maybe showing a bit more variability. Okay, you could look at those two charts and that is maybe what you see. But really what I'm trying to, what we hopefully will address here is using the two together to actually maybe come up with a slightly different picture. So if we then, you may not be able to see this because just on the size of the screen that you're looking at, but this current sample here is at a concentration. Let me see if I can just change my layout here as well. No, that's not what you want. No, okay, we'll just carry on with this one. So it's just a bit small on my screen as well, the way that the layout is. But really, okay, what we're showing here is this sample is at a concentration, which is basically this sample here. So this plot represents this plot on the concentration chart. But it's also then you have samples at the same concentration in this set of results here, which then match up with these samples. Then again, these two samples here are at the same concentration, and these are these samples. So what initially looked like a variability at a low concentration isn't actually that. What you're seeing is poor performance at this concentration, where you then have corrected that. Okay, you're running with a negative bias, but you've corrected those results. But so these are at that concentration, these are these samples. Then what we see is a shift in performance, and there's a gradual upward trend until you're now currently with this current sample. So what can we learn from this? Basically, well, you don't have the variability that this necessarily maybe appeared to be in the first instance, what you're actually showing here is that performance that you have corrected, and then where this sample here, you've actually now starting to drift. So this is a prime example where you may, obviously you've made a correction at this stage to bring the performance back in line. So in this case here, for this sample, which is starting to head that way again, is to look at what happened back at that time, what happened at that period of time, and what corrective actions that you put into place at that time. So this is something that you may then need to replicate because your performance is starting to drift and starting to show. Okay, it's still just within one standard deviation. You're just borderline with one standard deviation there. So it's still well within the limits, but it's providing you with a information which is going to enable you to put corrective actions into place much earlier. So then you can have, once again, you can check the effectiveness of that as well. So keeping closer, tighter control over your performance than before everything actually did fall out and actually then deteriorated to poor performance as it had in this situation here with this sample. So hopefully you can see in this case, using the two charts together, looking at the concentrations in sample order, then is giving you a slightly different picture than the percentage deviation in just in concentration. So you have to use the two together. Okay, sorry. Sorry, I've just think I've just jumped a slide there. Sorry, there we are. Okay. Slightly different picture here. And here, once again, if you look at the concentrations, the performance across the concentrations generally looks fairly steady. Apart from these two samples, these two outliers, which represent then these two plots here, if anything, general performance looks reasonable. Okay, but can we learn anything else? Well, obviously, what we had here is at this early stages, performance was, first of all, it was closer to the mean. Then we had a period of variability, but after this plot here, as you can see, we're now running with a slight positive bias, which slight trends, slight improvements, and now it's showing an upward trend again. Current sample is then showing a deviation which is greater than anything that we've seen before. So this is, once again, another situation where, yes, everything's still within the performance limits. However, looking at overall performance, the current sample, greater deviation at this concentration than we've experienced before. And also we're starting to see an upward trend again. So it's something then that I think we need to look at in more detail. Certainly this is where you're going to start looking at your internal QC once again to see if you're seeing any trends developing in it as well. But it's trying to capture performance before it deteriorates, before you have failures. So a number of different things that are happening here. Certainly, based compared to historical performance, you're now running with a positive bias, and certainly then current sample seems to be generally higher, albeit to a small degree, but it's certainly greater than any of your historical samples. Once again, as I say, if you look at the concentrations on the chart, this will help you to see these sort of scenarios where you're looking at specific concentrations or performance at a certain concentration. Just to highlight once again the same chart here that we looked at, but this is the running mean chart. And you can see with this per result here, this outlier that we discussed earlier, this has dragged the running mean down. And so this won't improve until then you've basically cleared 10 samples past this per result here. So by next sample, so this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and that was the 10th sample. So by the next sample, then the performance should shift back up again. Okay, percentage deviation chart. What does this show us? Well, it could highlight a systematic error on the instrument. Results are measuring higher at the low concentrations, and you can see an upward trend, or vice versa. You're seeing a downward trend in the results as the concentration either decreases or a decreased acid concentration increases here. So, but what does this show us? Once again, current sample at this concentration does not match previous performance at this concentration, but it does match concentrations performance at the lower concentrations. So once again, this is something you really need to look at this with one of the other charts with the percentage deviation by sample and or the SDI, just to see if this is once again a sudden shift in performance or whether you've seen then a trend developing. But yes, this is useful, but you need just to take the whole picture altogether to see how whether these are once again per performance that you have now corrected. So this is actual historical performance that is no longer current. And this is actually your current performance here, which is actually matches with the other concentrations. So once again, which parameter has better performance? Okay, we've got an example here where you've got lots of shifts of performance, up and down, bit of variability, and an improvement here. Glucose, you've got a large downward trend before correction and now performing much better. Really what I want to highlight with this is looking at then the the ranges for each of the parameters. So if we look at the percentage deviation charts, and this is the case by concentration, you can see and the glucose looks quite variable. The partial oxygen then, well, first of all, looks a bit tighter, but yet running with a negative bias. Whenever we look at the ranges, then we can see then the partial oxygen then goes up to plus or minus 30%, whereas the glucose only goes up to 8%. So these are, it looks quite variable, but that's because of the scale, whereas the partial oxygen then looks tighter together, but it's actually much more variable because of the larger scale. So just something to be aware of as well, looking at the scales, and they will be different from parameter to parameter. So in this case, I would say probably glucose is the best performance. Overall, is within a tighter range, and it's showing variability plus, so you're getting normal distribution either side of the target, whereas your partial oxygen is running with a negative bias, and also it's quite variable because of looking at the scale here as well. So I would say glucose is running with a better performance. Okay, how to review your EQA results? Well, I'm not sure, once again, who's really has joined our webinar today. Some of this may be very familiar with you, to you, but just for those people who are maybe watching online, then we're going to just go through general steps about how to review our reports. What are the first steps that we need to look at once we're getting our reports back to us? So, very simple question. Is the result within acceptable limits or not? So if we go down to no, first of all, let's look at that. So let's look at the simple things first. So has a transcription error occurred? So you've written in the wrong result. If it has, then very simple, send us the correct result along with the relevant documentation to us, and we'll get that corrected, as long as it's done within the specified 4 weeks. Okay, if it's not a transcription error, are you correctly registered? Or have anything changed within your setup, new reagents, new lots, new methods, for example, that you just haven't informed us about? It may have been previously correct, but things can change within our setup. So just confirm that the assay details actually are indeed correct. Once again, if they're not, just send us the correct details and we'll get that set up for you correctly. Okay, if that's correct, so it's not transcription, it's not your methods, not your assays. Okay, let's then look at the summary page. So once again, looking at the simple things here, as we mentioned earlier, are all the majority of the results flagged? If they are, then it may be the wrong sample. It may be a reconstitution problem. Once again, if we looked at this example, what does this indicate? Percentage deviations for, excuse me, are all roughly in the same ballpark. So it's more than likely a reconstitution problem. Okay, so where do we get to? We've checked that it's not transcription, it's not our assays. Okay, that's not all the results flagged. Well, if it is all flagged, then we've looked at those reasons. Okay, so let's review then our instrument parameters calibration, and basically, once again, has the reagent batch been changed? Very similar to what I mentioned earlier, but it does happen from time to time, as to say that a lot of labs can change. The reagent manufacturer sends out a new batch of reagent, which is actually a slightly different method, slightly different standardization. Sometimes we will have then specific methods for that. If that's not the case, then let's start looking at our internal QC. At the time that we ran the EQA sample. So let's look at that. Is the QC out of limits? First of all, at that time, was there any abnormal shifts in performance, or are we seeing any trends? We need really to make sure that we look at a like-for-like comparison. So whenever we're looking at our internal QC, make sure we're looking at, well, okay, what are the limits? What's the actual percentage deviation of my results here? Because we have multiple examples from labs who their internal QC looks fine, but that's only because they've got very wide limits and they're using the ranges from, for example, from the reagent manufacturer, or the QC manufacturer, and they're using that for their day-to-day comparisons, which may not be appropriate at all. So we want to investigate, we want to take corrective actions accordingly. The fact that if we're running a frequent EQA scheme means that we can do this investigation, we can take corrective actions as appropriate, and then by next sample, we can look to see whether they have been effective or not. But Is that all we do? So if we only look at the results which are outside our acceptable performance limits, well, I would say no. There's certainly lots of work that we can still look at to have better control of our performance, even within if the results are within our acceptable performance limits. So let's go the other way and say, okay, the results are all within our limits. What are we going to do? So we're going to review over the cycle. We're going to look at any points which are outside of 1SD as a starting point. And then we're going to look for trends, both positive and negative biases, and we're going to look for changes in performance. Just like the case that we looked at earlier, where performance had been poor in the past, we're now starting to see a trend developing. And it's very useful then is to say to nip that in the bud before it develops and gets any worse. So this is where we're really trying to have tighter control over the overall performance. But once again, just because it's within limits doesn't mean that we don't have biases. So we should be fluctuating around the target, around the mean. We shouldn't be running with a consistent bias. And this is obviously one of the main reasons for running EQA is for this detection of the bias that you may ignore, you may see in your internal QC. So, prime example in this case are all results on one side of the mean. So are we running with a consistent bias, which is probably indicative of a systematic error? So once again, we're asking the question, are all results on one side of the mean? If it's yes, then obviously it's an indication of a potential positive or negative bias, or it could still be then the development of a trend. If the answer is no, probably at this stage, no further actions. No further actions apart from obviously recording your results and keeping that for your records for moving forward. It is important that we do have good records of our performance and our EQA for our accreditation purposes. And even if we're not from an accredited lab, it's still very useful basically to see how things have changed over time, what corrective actions we put into place, and we can use that for helping control our quality system as we move forward. Basically, we're asking the question, looking at all these things, is the issue just me? Is it just for this sample? Is it the same for others using my instrument/reagent? If it is the same for others, then have any changes been made to the instrument reagent? For example, have there been any new lots of reagent controls? Have any field notices been sent out informing of expected changes in performance? Something which is not just specific for yourself. It's an instrument problem, it's a reagent problem, or where there's been restandardization, which is now being taken place. If it isn't the group as a whole, if it is just yourself, then we're going to look at, okay, is it the start of something new or is it an ongoing issue? Once again, do you see the same issue with your internal QC? You more than likely will look at your calibration because obviously EQA is looking at biases and we control that mainly with our calibration. Have our changes been made to the instrument reagents without informing us? Once again, any maintenance due or overdue. Sometimes performance issues occur actually after maintenance has occurred, so it's not necessarily that the instrument needs maintenance. Sometimes it can happen because we've put corrective actions into place without knowing what the root cause of the problem was initially. So if we have made those corrective actions, sometimes maintenance then actually fixes what the initial root cause may have been. And so our corrective action is inappropriate. So once again, need to keep good records of what we've done historically. There is an EQA checklist that we have in our RIQAS Explain brochure, but certainly it's a very useful, just a simple checklist of aspects that we can go down, basically looking at yes, no answers, just to make sure that you have tried to investigate all the causal factors. Sometimes it may be multiple, not necessarily. Certainly root causes are very often not a single item. And there can be multiple root causes involved. But as far as EQA is concerned, as far as the standards concerned for the international, for your accreditation, you need to come to a conclusion. You should have remedial action that you've put into place. And then, of course, you want to sign, date that, keep that on your records. But most importantly, you want then to see how effective your remedial action has been. So you're basically looking for your next EQA sample. Okay, I'm not going to go through a huge amount here, but there are obviously multiple issues that may occur whenever you're trying to eliminate the root causes. As we mentioned, maintenance, calibration, using calibrations past expiry. Do the calibrators actually achieve their full expiry date, or are they values changing over time? Basically, then, if a calibration's been done, is it due? Did it pass? I have a number of examples just coming up where really the main issues has been from the calibration. But we'll look at that just in a moment. Of course, reagents can be a big factor for a big causal issue. Are reagents being used past expiry? Are they achieving the stability claims from the provider? You may want to review reagent sample storage. Once again, use of fresh reagents, rerun the sample. A lot of aspects come down as well to our training and to the operators of the instrumentation. Are the correct procedures being followed? Really as well from your pre-analytical all the way through to your post-analytical, making sure your procedures are adequate and that they are indeed being followed. Are the parameters that they test for that test correct on the analyzer? So simple things, maybe not so much nowadays, and some more of the modern instrumentation. This is maybe more something going from historical, where we were able to change some of the settings a bit more easy. And sometimes that was the cause, because they were easy to be changed. So yeah, volume, temperature, wavelength. But I mentioned there just at the very end about staff training. It is, even with the current systems, which are a bit more black box, there obviously still need staff training for whenever things do go wrong and how those can be corrected. So I mentioned at the start of the presentation, we have had roughly about 800 incidences of where our running means have improved by 50 or more. Obviously, there have been a lot more where you've had smaller improvements as well. But just to finish, just a few situations, just I want to show you just basically where the system has worked for these customers. So in this case here, this is alkaline phosphatase. This is an old example, but it's very useful. Slightly different chart format back in the day. And this is actually from the time when we actually ran a weekly scheme for our chemistry program. In this case here, you had a lab who was running two programs. So they're running the national scheme and they were also running on RIQAS. On RIQAS, they were showing a positive bias. They said that their registration was correct and their internal QC was all within limits. Now, I'm not going to go through the full corrective actions that we did with them, but the root cause in the end, or was not the root cause, what they had done was the bias was caused by a 10% slope that they had introduced to remove the bias in their second scheme and the alternative scheme, which in this case was the national scheme. They had a bias on the second EQA scheme. They had reassigned their internal QC targets once they had introduced the 10% slope. And because of that, then what they were saying to us was actually correct. So their internal was fine whenever they were discussing it with us. But the root cause of the problem was the slope that they had introduced. As I say, once they removed the slope, then RIQAS performance improved dramatically, as you can see. It didn't mean then that their national scheme then actually developed a bias instead. So what was the root cause? The root cause of this was actually down to the material between the two schemes. The national scheme had a matrix effect, which then wasn't seen on ours. So whenever, as you can see, whenever they removed the bias, then whenever they removed the slope, then the bias was removed. So it all came down to a matrix effect between the two schemes. And it also highlights the fact that for introducing corrective actions where you don't know the root cause. So in this case here, they made a change without really knowing what the root cause of the problem was. So they actually introduced a problem, they introduced a bias into their quality system. So they actually made the situation worse. Whereas then, because then the internal QC was only looking at your precision, then it was fine and it was acceptable for them. Second case was triglycerides. In this case here, we had a lab moving from cycle 61, 62. This is on our chemistry program. This is on our bi-weekly chemistry program. And as you can see, they had a positive bias, which was then gradually deteriorating further. Here we see them 4 cycles later, and their performance has improved dramatically. In this case, it was down to calibration frequency. So they changed their calibration frequency to weekly. Instead, previously the lab was only calibrated when changing the reagent lot. So the calibration itself, excuse me, there wasn't obviously wasn't achieving the full time, or basically the calibration wasn't being maintained. So they updated their calibration frequency. This kept them better control of their bias. So as you can see, performance is great now with only a rare outlier, which you do expect from time to time. In this case, HDL, something very similar, except this case here, you see multiple shifts. So they were running with good performance and then gradually shift down, and then shift down once again. So the performance was gradually deteriorating. This is, you'll see a gradual picture here developing. So once again, this was down to, or how they fixed it was they looked at their calibration. Calibration frequency, in this case, was adjusted to every 15 days. Previously only calibrated when changing the reagent lot. And now what they do is they keep regular review, or with a regular review, then should I say, this keeps performance in check. So as you can see, they do still see slight trends developing, but they are keeping on control of this now to bring this back up into line each time. Full proteins. In this case here, we see they were running with a negative bias, and they had a sudden shift, and now their performance is actually running very acceptably. This case here was the same. I think actually this is the same lab where they actually then adjusted their calibration to every 15 days again. One thing that they did notice as well, that they found that the calibrator was losing its stability. So they now use only fresh calibrator with a maximum of three days preparation. And as you can see, this has helped to improve their performance dramatically. Uric acid, in this case, here we see where we had a drift in performance and then a correction. Calibration frequency, once again, was standardized at 1 month. Previously, they only calibrated with a change of reagent lot. One of the other aspects, because we do find that very often there are multiple issues happening. In this case here, the reagent was deteriorating on board due to reagent kit size and the low test turnover. So they actually found there were multiple issues occurring as well. They are still, should I say, they actually are still running with a negative bias in this case, which still needs to be addressed. So this is still an issue that they need to look at to correct it further. Just a couple to finish. Cholesterol. Here we go. Cycle 5960, we had a sudden shift in performance. They were running acceptably, and then big negative bias. And here we are, 5 cycles later, performance had improved. But the problem here, whenever I asked them how did they improve their performance, they had taken no direct intervention or no root cause. So it is possible that your performance will shift without taking any immediate, any direct intervention. But this is something which we would definitely not recommend. Let's look at their long-term performance. This is the performance over that period of time. So we had sudden shift in performance, as we saw in the slide. It was run for a substantial length of time. Then, once again, their performance, out of no direct intervention, their performance improved, then became much more variable. Once again, sudden shifts in performance, run with a negative bias again, although not to the same extent, before then their performance is improved. Where should they have taken corrective action? Obviously, at this point, where they could have avoided all this poor variability. This is a lab, even though they were running EQA, wasn't really utilizing it and wasn't taking corrective actions. They certainly weren't really reviewing it. So this was a lab who was really just using it for a tick box exercise. But as we can see in the previous examples, it does work, but it does mean that you have to review the performance, you have to take these corrective actions, and there is work involved in doing that. But so RIQAS does work, but you do have to put some of the effort in yourself. So thanks very much, everyone,